We're going to go see Jack now. Jack is a 20-year-old male nursing student who came sort of at the insistence of his parents. He was driving his parents nuts. They lived in Chicago, and he was going to St. Louis University. He would be calling them all the time for reassurance, asking them every night, like, do you think I did this right? Do you think I did that right? And they found, this is not an unusual story, they found our clinic and got him to us. He was sort of classic occupational and academic perfectionist. He had trouble writing papers, he had trouble with his clinicals, he had performance anxiety, his core fear that he would fail and not make it. And we gave him OCD diagnosis, social anxiety, moderate depression. He also had, quite frankly, a fear of driving, as I mentioned. So we had to get that treated as well. He would Uber over, but he had limited income as a student. So I want to talk about the engagement phase. I picked this case for a lot of reasons. It illustrates a lot of issues that we grapple with. And the treatment was not short-term treatment. And I think what's really important for therapists to understand especially, the evil part of me when I do trainings for therapists, I want to get up there and say, yes, and this all happened in 10 weeks, and it went perfectly. Because it's a good way to induce insecurity and self-doubts in therapists. And I don't know why you'd have any case that wasn't treated completely in 10 weeks, perfectly, without any episode. So I like to talk about the complicated cases, the ones that didn't go perfectly, or that took longer than we thought, because they're real. That's the reality. In some of our research, we have to control things more in order to have scientific validity, but in the real world, it gets complicated. So he actually was one of those patients. I also talk about treatment interfering behavior sometimes, and that's another area of interest of mine, and that's just things that patients do that unintentionally interfere with treatment. And one of them is downplaying the problem. So so the patient's there, you do this evaluation, and they come in the next week and they say, you know, I don't think it's that bad. Whoa, 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 whoa. Now, I spent all week putting a treatment plan together. You're going to do it. I don't care whether you think it's an important problem or not. My time's worth. Well, now, obviously, if the patient truly assessed that he had exaggerated this problem, it's really not a problem, we wouldn't be treating him against his will. But a lot of times that ends up being avoidance because they start to get anxious about the therapy, and one good way to not do therapy is to downplay the problem. It's not that bad. Or I think I can do it myself. I don't need a therapist. Which may be true, by the way. I'm not saying everybody needs us, which is hard for me to say. I like to think that everybody needs us, but they don't. But in his case, he was really kind of avoiding the therapy. He was good at sort of downplaying it. And I said, don't you have some incompletes? Yeah, but blah, blah, blah. So we had to kind of manage that and do some motivational work to sort of help him understand. And we do that by helping them look at, the impact on their life, what they can't do that they would like to be able to do, of course. We also do what we call an impact analysis, where we also look at the impact of their problem on other people's lives. So as part of that process, we have them interview the people, in this case, his parents, and to find out what's the impact on your life, parents, of my problem. And all of this is to really crystallize, without dulling it down, the real serious impact of this problem on his life. And bottom line is his whole career aspirations were at risk. So also part of this was also assessing his ability to accept some things you can't control. Like, what if it doesn't work out for you in nursing? Do you have some other ideas about what you might do? Now that might seem in one way counterproductive. Like, why would you have him? That seems defeatist. Like, you're accepting that he won't be successful. Not really. It is the pressure that this is the singular profession. This is the only way I can be fulfilled, is to be a nurse. It is that singular myopic perspective that actually increases more anxiety and makes him, if you have multiple possibilities for careers, and if this doesn't work out, I can become a blah, 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 you're going to be at less anxiety than if this is the only ticket to your happiness in life. So we're actually trying to sort of loosen up some of his objectives and be able to be more flexible in thinking about other possibilities, with no intention of not working hard on making him successful as a nurse, but simply to give him some other options to maybe lighten the anxiety in the background. Okay, our goals were, in terms of his treatment goals, were to participate in clinicals. Clinicals are the rotations that they do, and to be able to do that without seeking reassurance, because he was driving his instructors nuts too. And also to follow a study schedule as prescribed, and then eventually to catch up incompletes. But our deal was we're not going to work on the incompletes until you're well into your therapy. Because once you start working on your incompletes, we want you to know how to do it following ERP. So he had one belief that negative feedback means I'm a failure. If you're competent, you do things perfectly. He really believed that, and so we had to do what we call utility analysis, and I'll explain what that is. And we also had to challenge his, and this is not an unusual thing either. It's hard to say you have a problem if you're a perfectionist, because then that means, again, that you're not meeting your ideal, which is perfection. So just the admitting he had a problem was related to his perfectionism, because that would be a flaw, and you're not supposed to have flaws. So we had to work on that as well. Now, utility analysis is helping patients understand the usefulness of their thoughts, not the truthfulness of their thoughts, or the accuracy of their thoughts. So, for example, if you have a depressed patient, the patient says, I'm a bad person, what would be a natural response for anybody to say, or even a therapist?
No, you're not.
No, you're not. You're not a bad person. And then when you say that to a depressed patient, this is a true or false question. True or false, their response is, oh my God, you're right. I never thought about that. I see it all clearly now. I have good points and bad points just like anyone else. Why should I single myself out in some false category of badness? That only makes me more depressed. Thank you, Dr. Pollard. I think we're done now. Okay, true or false? That's the maybe not. No, what do they do instead? If you say, you're not so good, I think you're a good person. What's a likely response?
They try to prove that they're bad.
What's that?
They try to prove that they're bad.
Yeah, they argue with you, which I get all upset by that. Just like, all right, I'm taking time out of my busy day to make you feel better, and what do? You argue with me. What's that? Come on. So why would they argue? Well, of course, this is the dynamic of reassurance seeking, right? So I'm going to argue with you so you can come back with a snappy response. And eventually, I'm just going to keep arguing with you, which seems counterproductive because I would probably want them to say the nice thing and make me feel better, but it doesn't make me feel better because I'm not certain yet that it's right. So you got to keep arguing the other side until I'm whisked into a delusion of certainty that I am not a bad person, or not a serial killer, or not a whatever. Fill in the blanks. So, so instead of getting into, now there's so many reasons not to tell somebody who says they're a bad person that they are a good person. Even though it might be counterintuitive, we're trained to be sympathetic. But because you get that, you're actually creating the condition under which they are going to defend being a bad person more. You be the angel, they're going to be the devil. You want them to be the angel, so you've got to have them find a way to look at why that's destructive, to say things like that to yourself. And it's not destructive because it's wrong. I have no idea whether it's wrong. I don't even know what a bad person is, to be quite frank. If someone could tell me at the break, like, what are the 5 characteristics of bad people, then I'd know. But it's not meant to be a real description of the person. It's intended to be a way to put yourself down and to get a response from the other person. So don't go there. This would be true for family members too. But if you said, when you accept the idea that you're a bad person, how does it make you feel? Well, I feel horrible. And when you feel horrible, does that affect your behavior? Well, yeah. I kind of withdraw and I don't do things as much, kind of hide. And when you withdraw and hide and don't do things as much, does that affect what you get out of life? Yeah, I don't get joy. I don't enjoy my life. I miss my friends because I'm withdrawing. And is withdrawal and missing your friends and not getting much out of life, is that consistent with your values and your goals in life? Is that your goal when you set out? Was to be isolated and withdrawn and not with friends? Well, of course not. Okay, so let's take a look. You're accepting a proposition about yourself that leads you to emotional outcomes, behavioral outcomes, and actual outcomes that are completely inconsistent with your own goals. And then you just rest for that. So that would be what we call utility analysis, helping people look at the effect of their thinking, not the truthfulness of it. Because if you take the alternative route and argue that they're a good person, you know what the response when you say there's a good person, at the very least they're going to go, uh-huh. And then you know the therapeutic response, of course, back is, uh-huh. And they go, uh-huh. You go, uh-huh. They go, uh-huh. By the way, research has shown that 352 uh-huhs, they stop. Or you could just do a utility analysis. So that's what we did with him. We looked at the effect of these beliefs on his life, not whether they're right or wrong. Because that's a dimension that will lead you nowhere. So if you believe that negative feedback means you're a failure, if you believe that, and then we create an alternative belief like negative feedback is part of learning. I can't succeed if I don't have negative feedback. And then we compare the two in terms of the outcome on their life. What would that mean? And Jack's able to see that. But if I just said that's a rigid belief, that's wrong, or that's not going to go anywhere. Okay, so that was kind of the first part of trying to get Jack engaged, because he had these rigid beliefs that were sort of going to get him into trouble and not allow him to do ERP. Because why are you going to do an exposure in which you risk making a mistake if you believe these catastrophic things intellectually about making mistakes? So we do need to get him prepared, make sure he fully sees the depth of the problem so he has motivation, and that's what this first step was. So then we went into skills training, because Jack needed a lot of things. He really was not good at time management. And so when you are trying to get someone to prioritize things that they value. So we do values clarification. What are the things that you value? How do you see your life? How would it look if you were 2 years from now? Sometimes you have to go out in the future because right now they can't see anything. So 3 years from now, how would you like your life to look? Like, would you be working? Where might you be working? Would you have time for relationships? How much time? Any sports? Any hobbies? Anything? And literally start to put that into a schedule. How would that map out over a week? So that they start to make priorities instead of have perfectionistic idealism that I can do everything, but really start to map out commitments to time, protecting, and learn the concept of protecting time for things. And then we would make a schedule and have him, much like many of the therapists here are familiar with behavioral activation, not unlike that. And then we make adjustments based on feedback. Remember, perfectionists don't adjust. They keep doing something based on their ideal as opposed to real data. So when the patient comes in and they said, oh, I see you got up at 10 instead of 8 o'clock, and you had it on your schedule to get up at 8. So we need to either figure out an intervention that will help you get up at 8, or we need to make that goal more realistic, closer to what you're doing, so you're not setting yourself up for frustration. We can always build from there, but our goal is to get what you say you're going to do consistent with what you actually do, and that's more important than writing something ambitious on a piece of paper that you never do, and starting to get the connection between planning and doing. And so that took a while with him because he would come back and he would want to do what I call the perfectionist proclamation, which is when they don't do the thing that they set out to do, they proclaim that they should do it and will do it. And I said, well, okay, let's review now. Each time you don't do something, it's totally cool. That's how we learn, no problem. But we need to either lower the goal or add some help to you to help you do it. But what we can't do is have you leave here proclaiming that you ought to do it and you will do it, because that's not an intervention. I assumed last week when you told me you were going to do it, you were sincere, you weren't lying to me. Well, of course not. Okay, well that's not really change, is it? It's change if we do something differently. So I would say to all therapists, you probably already know this already, so always do, if there's been failure to do something, always leave the office with something new. Even, you don't know it's going to be right, but don't accept, I proclaim that I will do it. I really should do it. I mean it this time. That is not an intervention. Okay, that's a perfectionistic proclamation. You can tell them you're doing it. Pollard told me that's a perfectionistic proclamation. And they'll probably kick you. So, all right, so this was our first thing, because we felt like anything we asked him to do was never going to get done because the time management schools were so poor. And so we felt like this created a framework for us to begin to do some of the other things later on. And one of those things was ERP. So we started with clinical rotations. Now, we can simulate a lot of things that are like clinical rotations, but it's hard. Sometimes it's hard to come up with things that are going to be close to valid or legitimate in their life. So we did do some. We did do some imaginal flooding, in this case, to sort of supplement it. So we simulated conversations of Jack's supervisors criticizing his performance. And then we tested the idea that, can you handle this? Is it really true that you will disintegrate? And he listened to it. And he would listen to it in session, but then also at home. And he could use coping statements. he couldn't reassure himself that he will never be criticized by a supervisor. That would be compulsive, that would be OCD. But he could say, I'll handle it, it's not the end of the world. If somebody thinks I didn't do a good job, I'll learn from that. That would be appropriate processing as opposed to pretending that nothing bad is ever going to happen. Then we did also in vivo exposure, where he would have tasks that he would do under observation from someone else. And I or other members of our team would play the supervisor or the patient, and he would take their blood pressure, and then the therapist would offer critical comments, starting with pretty light criticisms, and then as he got used to that, we would get a little meaner, so to speak. But we weren't really trying to prepare him for some guy from like the devil or something, but just realistic criticism that you're going to get, feedback really. Even criticism sometimes is a bit of a harsh word for that.
Dr. Pollard,
Yeah.
do you ever get the client that comes in and says, we can do this, but it's not going to work with me because it's really not a real situation, and I know you're just acting.
Yeah.
So how do you?
Well, did everybody hear the question? She was saying, do you ever get it like somebody says, well, that's just acting, it's not, it's not going to be real to you. And they may be right about that, but I don't accept it. We'll do it and then see what their response is. I don't take their word for it. Not that I think they're not telling the truth, but sometimes, see, therapists in our field are always looking for avoidance. I mean, we are so preoccupied with that's avoidance coming up. So we're always suspecting it. If you said hello to most of us, we would, what are you avoiding? That's just the way we are, So a sneeze, avoidance. So I would want to make sure that that wasn't an attempt to not have to do that exposure. Because, see, you can get this, you can also get this perfectionistic paradox that handcuffs the therapist. Well, why don't we just simulate it and see, it's not gonna bother me, it's irrelevant. Okay, well then, I guess we'll have to start with your actual, like your supervisor listening to you. No, I can't do that. All right, well then, why don't we no, it's stupid, I can't. All right, then we go to the soup, no. Okay, what do you want from me? Okay, so you have to get past that, and we have to think together, creative ways, you the patient, me the therapist, and how we're going to access your fear. So that you don't have to, the first time, do it in front of a real-life situation. And we got to think together about how to do that. So let's just try it as simulation. Now, we do have ways we can do that. So, for example, and much of this depends on your resources. You can figure out ways, like, okay, when you do this work, we're going to video it. And then we are going to show it to one of our physicians. And they're going to critique it. So that would be an example of trying to step it up, right? So this work requires, like trying to get creative about how we're going to find things to make it more valid. Especially if things that we can have some control over. But you're right, it is a common dilemma, and it can be a challenge. So, but we get healthcare professionals and, of course, just liberal arts professional students from both Washington University and St. Louis University, University of Missouri, St. Louis, Southern Illinois University. So we get a lot of students who are in these situations where you're trying to figure out how to simulate real-life performance evaluation. So here's an example of reading. One of the tasks that you need to be able to do in academics is reading. And rereading is a common compulsion. And now there's a couple of reasons why a person with this problem might reread. It is possible that they actually were so worried about something from before, they're not paying attention to what they're reading, and they actually didn't comprehend it. But the other possibility is they're wanting to comprehend it perfectly. So each sentence has to be comprehended perfectly before you can move to the next sentence. So I have to go read it again just to make sure that I got it right. You can imagine how long that takes to get just the simple task of reading done. So again, here's an example of trying to get a hierarchy, right? So first we're going to read topics about that are not academically relevant. In fact, I actually try to find something they don't like, or they don't care about, or maybe not necessarily they don't like. But so, like if you're not into sports at all, well, let's read sports, because then you'll have the least. Let's make sure that you can read a paragraph or 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 about something that you don't care about, that is not perceived as important, without rereading. Why would we go to anything else if they can't do that? And we certainly wouldn't go to homework. Because remember, it's not reading, it's reading. ERP is reading without rereading. It's not reading. It's a difference. So they might read something and get it done and have reinforced their OCD like 10 times by rereading. That's not ERP. That's getting your homework done. That's why we have to make that distinction. One, the reading or the getting your homework done is done to get your homework done. ERP is not done to get your homework done. It's to provide conditions under which your brain can learn safety. It's safe to move on. I don't have to feel sure that I understood that sentence. Some of it may come later. I'll get it through other paragraphs, and maybe I'll never always feel sure, but I need to move on, feeling safe under those conditions. So reading about topics that are academically relevant, but perhaps not really their schoolwork, but something like if they're a physics major, maybe they read some article on physics, but not for a grade or not for the class. And only last would we actually use assignments that are related to the class. So here's an example of a response prevention. And we literally write this out. Instructions. When I feel the urge to reread, I will resist the urge and continue reading the paragraph without looking back. When I've finished the assigned reading task, I will cover the material so I cannot reread it and instead read my coping script until I am confident I will not go back and reread. I will then proceed with the next reading exercise. Sometimes we have to use paper, like you start the paper at the top of the page and then you go down through covering up things so you can't reread. Whatever we can do to try to put them in that state of uncertainty that they might not have understood it perfectly. Because that is part of the condition in which you want to expose them, is the sense of not knowing for sure. That's as important as the qualities of the room, the nature of the task. It is evoking that sense of uncertainty, because the feeling that I'm not certain or not right has become a danger signal to the person. It creates anxiety. So what's a coping script? A coping script is something that you want them to do instead of the compulsion. So when we say to folks, let's say if I have a tapping compulsion, okay, then if we just say don't tap, that's okay, and if they can do it, that's fine, it'll work. But it may be easier for folks to have something to do instead of that makes the tapping not likely. So if instead of saying don't tap when you get triggered, if you said take your hand, put it in a ball, and put it in your pocket, and wait till the urge, till you're confident that you're not going to give in to the urge to tap, and don't take it out of your pocket till then. That would be an example of a competing response. So for mental rituals, like trying to figure things out or whatever, competing response might be a coping script that helps them deal with the uncertainty. So this says, I'm having doubt and OCD wants me to get rid of it, but every time I give in, my OCD becomes stronger and I become weaker. I can never be certain it is perfect and it will never feel completely right. I might make a mistake. I might have missed something. I might disappoint someone. But wasting more time in compulsions will not prevent that. Trying to make things perfect has cost me countless hours and robbed me of time for other things important to me. My girlfriend has threatened to leave me, and I will not graduate if I don't stand up to the OCD, learn to live with the imperfect feeling, and act despite feeling uncertain. So the coping script reminds them, why am I doing this? And it also reminds them of the futility of doing what the urge is telling them to do. And so you want them to stay in that till they can say, I'm not going to go back and reread. I'm going to move on to the next task. Now that's somewhat time consuming. That is not a replacement for homework. This is learning. It's using the homework as a trigger to practice that. Yes?
I just had a client ask me, because we were talking about a coping script, not quite as long as that, and my client said, isn't that a compulsion?
Yeah, great question. The answer is no.
I said no.
And you know, the reason that it's not is because I told him to do it. So that couldn't possibly be. Yes. The question was, one of the patients said, how do we know a coping script is not a compulsion? If you don't do it right, it can become one. And I know using the word right sounds a little harsh, but given the context of our discussion today, but there's nothing, that might be inspiring, but there's nothing reassuring about, we don't say you didn't make a mistake. We said you might not have. That is not reassuring to the OCD. So I've never seen that kind of script become a compulsion. If anything, we have to push them to listen to it, because their natural tendency is to go into the figuring out compulsions or reassurance seeking and checking. Yeah.
So to piggyback off of that, one of the major issues that I have is when I go through my coping script, my OCD will come in and say that I haven't done it right. So the correct tactic that I've always seemed to go for is to say I'm not doing it right.
Yeah.
That's it. I don't have it down. I don't have it figured out, and then it no longer feeds in that compulsion, because the compulsion wants me to keep thinking, are you doing this right?
That's great. Yeah, and for those who didn't hear, he was saying that sometimes he's doing exposure, and the OCD will come in about, are you doing your therapy right? Are you doing, you mean the ERP right? Yeah. And then it makes you question that. And again, if that becomes a persistent thing, you can sometimes anticipate it and put it into the coping script. I may or may not be doing my therapy right. It really doesn't matter. I'll discover it and I'll tweak as I go along. You can kind of put that in if you need to, but you found a way to sort of shut it up by saying, I'm not doing it right.
Yeah, don't be rigid. Allow it to flow either way.